I think the most ironic thing about Mrs. Mariam Nichols's overly enthusiastic interest in her son's education was Andrew's own utter disinterest in any of it, save for very subject I happen to teach. In every other lesson, he would either sit at the back and doodle gruesome little images into an exercise book, or else stare utterly disinterested out of the window. He would steadfastly refuse to answer questions in class or to work with other students on what were supposed to be group projects. If he spoke 2 words in an entire term, then the teachers of those subjects considered themselves lucky, and in most classroom tests and mock exams, he would refuse to write. Since schools often get teachers on free periods rather than external staff to oversee things like mock exams, I'd had the opportunity to witness this particular behaviour. I watched as the other students furiously scribbled, trying to get every detail into their paper as quickly as possible, and Andrew simply refused. He did not disrupt the exam, but instead spent the first 10 minutes carefully arranging his pens, pencils, and other stationery on the desk, and then simply sat in silence, glaring contemptuously at the other students, counting down the minutes until his exam paper, pristine and entirely untouched, would be collected in. He would, I assume, have been thrown out of most other schools for such behaviour. The problem was that despite regarding the lessons with contempt, Andrew was clearly taking in every word that was said. On external examinations, when the paper would be sent to markers outside of the school and the marks would actually count toward grades, he would perform well, often achieving the highest marks in the class. Whilst most of the teachers wrote him off and spoke of him in the staff room as a petulant, stuck-up little shit, he was also remarkably gifted and academically brilliant when he wanted to be. I first met Andrew on the day of my interview for the job. I had been invited to attend the interview and to teach one lesson that would be observed and assessed by the head teacher so they could get an idea of my teaching style. That lesson and interview went well, or at least well enough to be better than the other candidates and land me the job. Andrew wasn't in the lesson. I met him during my lunch break. He was sitting beneath a tree reading a book titled The Occult Mysteries of the Tarot. This being a religious school, I assumed that this was meant as a defiant act of teenage rebellion. The boy, obviously knowing that some teachers, adults and parents would be disturbed by the idea of a child reading anything with the word occult associated with it. Certainly he looked the very picture of a moody teenager, black hoodie of some heavy metal band pulled over his head despite it being a warm spring day, a flop of jet black dyed hair falling over one of his eyes, which was heavily eyelinered in spite of the school's policy on not allowing excessive makeup, especially for boys. Having grabbed a sandwich and decided I was going to enjoy it on the bench close to where Andrew was sitting with his back against the bark, I couldn't help but notice his curious glance when I parked myself up and started fishing in my bag for a book of my own. Having caught his eye, I decided to engage him in conversation. After all, I thought, if I did end up getting the job, then he could end up being one of my students. "You into this kind of stuff then?" I said, pointing to the book. "Must be a bit of a touchy subject around here." Andrew lowered the book, fixed his eyes on me for just long enough to communicate that I wasn't worthy of a response, and lifted the book to continue reading without bothering to reply. Of course, I wouldn't invest too heavily in that stuff. I mean, a lot of folks put a lot of stock in it, but I pointed again vaguely to the cover which showed the Wheel of Fortune card from the Rider-Waite-Smith pack on the cover. The Occult Secrets of the Tarot? Well, it was all made up by 2 French fellas a few centuries back. Again the book lowered, but this time in contrast the brow had raised, softening the features. He still didn't speak, but I was used to seeing that glance. It was a look that said, "Tell me more." "Yeah," I said through a cheek full of cheese sandwich. Before that, tarot was just a card game, but there was this French guy called de Gebelin. He was writing serialized books on the occult and basically making half of the stuff up. He came up with the idea that the tarot went back to ancient Egypt, and that the deck is actually a book with preserved magical knowledge in it. The book descended lower so that it rested on Andrew's lap.
"Yeah, that's what I read it was,"
he said, looking down at the book he had been reading suspiciously. "Well, that's pretty much the idea." Then another French guy called Millet took that idea further and said that the images were encoded messages. That was then picked up by a guy called Attila, who was the first to introduce the idea of the cards being used for divination.
"Like seeing people's fortunes and stuff?"
Andrew added supportively. "Yeah, exactly. That then got picked up and expanded by a guy called Eliphas Levi, and Andrew almost jumped forward.
I've read him. He's the guy who did the creepy Baphomet devil drawing with the goat's head, right?
He said, leaning forward as if he was half thinking of joining me at the bench. At this point, I did not know about Andrew's behaviour in other lessons, and so I didn't regard his choice to speak to me as some kind of revolutionary act. I just talked to him as I would most older students. That's the guy, but that diagram isn't the devil, it's something else. We can talk about that later. Anyway, it goes from there to British occultists and gets all these different meanings associated with it. But basically, all the illusions and all the encoding and occult stuff was just made up, like there's no big mythology behind it or long lineage. If you go back to Agrippa, no mention. It was just an idea people liked and then ran with. Now, Andrew did stand up. He was surprisingly tall for his age, and in what I did regard as a significant act, he pulled down his hood as he took a seat beside me. The book, which he clearly now regarded as useless, remained open and abandoned on the floor.
How do you know so much about the tarot? Are you a magician or something?
No. I managed to get out eventually. I'm a teacher. It's not that I know a lot about tarot in particular. I just know a lot of history. It's kind of my job.
Wait, are you going to replace Mrs. Parrish?
He said, the smallest hint of excitement creeping into his voice. I hope so. Just had my interview, so we'll see. I'm Mr. Kenlon, by the way. I extended my hand to shake his, but Andrew ignored it. Not purposely, it seemed, but because he was distracted, focused, invested, and interested in the conversation.
I hate Mrs. Parrish. She's a terrible teacher. You know, she gave us a worksheet the other day that said hundreds of millions of years ago, in Bible times. Like that was seriously what she'd written. She's supposed to be a history teacher. I mean, Bible times, hundreds of millions of years. Modern Homo sapiens have only been around for about 200,000 years. It's ridiculous.
He shook his head as I wisely kept my opinions to myself.
So, will you be teaching stuff like this? If you get hired, I mean.
About the tarot? Seems unlikely here, doesn't it? I teach what's on the curriculum. But that doesn't mean I can't give you books you can read on stuff that you're interested in. I mean, they'll mostly be history books, but if you're into stuff like the occult and magic, then a lot of that overlaps with history and religion and stuff. Here? I took a pen and paper from my bag and scrawled down the names of a few authors who had written on the history of tarot cards. These aren't really going to be in the school library, so you might need to get them online or from a bigger library in the city, but in the meantime... From my bag, I took a copy of Llewellyn's complete book of ceremonial magic that had been reading and handed it to him. This is pretty heavy academic stuff in parts, so I'll understand if you find it boring. Maybe dip into it, and if you have questions and I get hired, we can talk about it some other time. Andrew looked carefully at the names I had scrawled and began to flick through the book. I watched as his eyes lit up.
But wait, if you don't get hired, I'll never see you again, so how am I going to get this back to you?
He said, concerned. I shook my head and smiled. I finished it anyway. Keep it. Maybe if I leave something here, then the universe will know I have to come back. That's some kind of magic, isn't it? For the first time, Andrew actually smiled.
I hope you do get hired,
he said bluntly. Me too, I said. With a chuckle, I hadn't even left the grounds when my phone rang to confirm just that. Whilst he was an intractable enigma and an absolute nightmare for other teachers, for me, Andrew was a model student. That one meeting, our subsequent conversations about the history of magic, and a shared interest in the history of esotericism meant that he treated me with respect and warmth. He genuinely seemed to enjoy my lessons, and though he would challenge me if he thought that I'd made a mistake or said something that didn't fit with his reading, I more than welcomed that interaction because at least it meant he was reading. I was never afraid of being proven wrong and told my students as much. If you know enough to prove me wrong on any point, then you're basically teaching yourself and doing my job for me. Happy days. I want you to read wider and find out more. I want to learn from you too, so anytime you think I'm wrong, let me know. You can check, I can check, or we can check together, but one way or another we'll all get smarter. I laughed. Andrew accepted the challenge. He read everything. Prescribed material, additional material, material referenced in the footnotes of the prescribed material, and in the footnotes of the additional material, he knew the topics backward and was far more gifted than the other staff seemed to know or wish to acknowledge. You would think that this would make his mother my #1 fan, but unfortunately it doesn't always work like that. In her mind, with history, Andrew had discovered a path, an interest that he could pursue, and a direction in life which meant that suddenly history was the most important thing and she should hone in on it, and by extension with laser beam focus, and as is often the case, lasers can burn. My every move and decision was monitored and second-guessed in case I somehow took a misstep and derailed her son's newfound enthusiasm. Despite the fact that Andrew had 3 scheduled lessons, an extracurricular activity with me, and hung out in my classroom at lunchtime, I still saw almost as much of his mother as I did of him. Hardly a day went by when she wouldn't be waiting for me at the school gates or at the office. Interestingly, she mentioned to me several times during our discussions that she was deeply disapproving of the material that Andrew was reading, which she described as witchcraft. When I explained that what he was reading was primarily academic material on the history of the occult and esotericism, she simply put her nose in the air and made a veiled threat.
Well, just as long as he carries on doing well in your class. I mean, it would be terrible in a Catholic school if the governors or the head was to find out that you were sharing witchcraft material with the pupils.
What she was implying was that if Andrew's interest waned or he stopped doing so well in history, then she would reveal this information to my superiors. In reality, the senior management team were completely aware of what I'd been giving Andrew because I'd told them. Mostly because they'd asked what the hell I was doing to get him to come out of his shell when none of the other teachers could manage it. Their response, predictably, was far more understanding than Mrs. Nichols would have imagined.
Whatever you're doing, it's working, so for God's sake, keep doing it. He's even started completing tasks in other lessons.
That last bit was also true, though I take no credit for it. In my book, the change in attitude probably came down to the fact that he felt happier and more secure, knowing that someone had actually taken an interest in him. I'll also be honest and say that I liked Andrew. He was smart, and though he could be sulky and a little arrogant, he was also wickedly funny at times, with a dry sarcasm suited to a person many years his senior. He asked insightful questions, and when a subject interested him, would bore down into it with an enthusiastic focus that bordered on hunger. It was only in my 3rd year teaching him, when Andrew was 16 and preparing for GCSEs, that I began to wonder whether perhaps Mrs. Nichols's concerns about her son and his access to magical books might be warranted. I had stupidly agreed to run a revision session at lunchtime for the Year 13 students getting ready to sit mock exams. Since I knew most of them had free periods before lunch, I arranged the session to start around 15 mins into my lunch hour. This was to give the kids time to grab something from the canteen or an outside cafe that they could then bring to my room and eat during the revision session. Technically, this was against the rules, but it helped maximize the time and also made things a bit less formal, which is how I wanted the revision sessions to feel. Anyway, having finished a lesson with some younger kids, I dashed to the restroom to pee and was back in my own room by 5 minutes into the lunch break. My revision class students were not due for another 10 minutes, and I expected the room to be empty. Instead, I found Andrew. He was at the front of the room, squatting over one of the chairs close to where I had my desk. It was not where he usually sat, so it was difficult to work out what he might be doing there. In fact, in the previous lesson, the seat had been occupied by an obnoxious little rich girl named Gemma, who was a big part of the in crowd, universally popular, and about as polar opposite of Andrew in terms of status within the school as it was possible to be. As soon as I entered the room, however, and caught sight of the sheepish, guilty look on Andrew's face, I knew that whatever he was doing wasn't good. In one hand, he held a small cloth bag with a drawstring at the top, of the type that some people would use to store their sunglasses. In the same hand, clutched between 2 fingers, he had a pair of tweezers. On the other hand, he had a small piece of white paper onto which he had carefully placed several long blonde hairs. Judging from the length and colour of the hair, it was obvious that it did not belong to him, and he had evidently retrieved it from the seat, the table, or the floor around. Now, for most teachers, this would seem odd, perhaps a little creepy. There may be the excuse that the curious child was collecting these specimens for use in a science experiment, and had it been one of the other teachers that caught him, Andrew may well have mumbled something about looking at the hair under a microscope or exploring how proteins work. Knowing me and knowing the things I knew, he didn't bother with such excuses. He knew that I knew exactly what he was up to. Without saying a word, I put out my hand, requesting that he pass me the bag and the samples he had collected. At first, he glared back at me angrily, reluctant to hand them over. "Give!" I snapped firmly. That was the first time I'd ever had to raise my voice in that classroom, and I knew that the sudden break with my usual character would be striking. Andrew handed me the paper, continuing the hair and the small bag. Emptying the contents onto the desk confirmed my suspicions. There were the remnants of a small pencil that had once belonged to Gemma, emblazoned with some boy band. There were several beads from a broken bracelet, a scrap torn from one of her exercise books, and even a carefully wrapped piece of pre-chewed gum, which he had clearly retrieved from the underside of her desk. There were also several photographs of Gemma, cut from the school magazine, and of course a small bushel of retrieved hair. There were also two slightly more disturbing relics. One, a note was written in what I recognized as Gemma's handwriting that read simply "Freak," with what appeared to be a crude drawing of Andrew next to it. The other, a tiny, delicate animal skull around the size of a golf ball that I thought must once have belonged to a small monkey or shrew. I glared at Andrew and shook my head. "Really?" I said, allowing the fact that I knew what he was up to hang unexplained and unexplored between us. "You know, I can take a wild guess at what you're up to. Damn it, I can probably tell you exactly which book you got the idea from. But really, think about this." Andrew stood up without once looking me in the eye. He hung his head, avoiding my gaze like a dog that knows it has done something wrong. "If any other teacher had caught you, they'd think you were some kind of pervert, creeping around collecting bits from a girl you like. As it is, I caught you, and I can't explain what you're doing because, in a Catholic school, any school, what you're actually doing is probably worse."
I wanted to.
Andrew didn't finish. He didn't need to. What Andrew was attempting was a kind of sympathetic magic, operating on the idea that like affects like, and the principle of contamination, the idea that if someone touches something or is in close proximity to it, something of them or their essence remains with it. Magicians will often try to increase the effectiveness of their ritual acts by using things that the target of those operations has actually touched. Possessions or pieces of bodily detritus like fingernails, teeth, hair, or eyelashes are considered particularly potent ingredients. Andrew was collecting artifacts of Gemma's in order to perform magic with her as the target. "Sit down," I said to him sternly. Finally raising his head, Andrew looked me in the eye for the first time. "Sit down," I commanded, slamming my fist on the desk and startling the boy into compliance. Andrew pulled out what had been Gemma's chair. "No," I said, "not that one," and pointed to the next available chair. I cancelled my revision class that day. I placed a sign on the door to explain to my Year 13s that something had come up and that I would see them the following day. Instead, I spent the entire lunchtime having a long and serious discussion with Andrew about, of all things, magical ethics and the nature of consent. I explained how I didn't believe in the effectiveness of this stuff. But if I did, there would still be moral problems. How is the object of your desire or love spell really giving consent if they are compelled to lust after you because of some magical intervention? I asked Andrew point blank whether he thought Gemma was attracted to him. He shook his head. "So, if you do your little ritual and she comes to you after that, that's okay, is it? You're just going to bend her will and to hell with consent, is that it?" Andrew didn't respond. I nodded, as if in agreement and confirmation of my own argument. Now, I don't think this would work in a million years, but that's not the point. If it did work, and you were clearly hoping it would, then it would still be wrong. If it didn't, and you got caught doing what I just caught you doing, it would still be wrong. Can you imagine? Year 11 performing magical rituals to sexually exploit girls? Can you imagine that? You'd be expelled and thrown out of this school faster than your feet could touch the ground. I handed him back the small bag. Now, listen to me very carefully. I lowered my voice to a whisper, which I always found far more effective in disciplining students than shouting, "You can study this stuff, but if I ever catch you practicing or attempting to practice it in this school again, you're done. You understand?" Andrew nodded. "Now I'm giving this back to you because I don't know what kind of stuff you've already done with it. Whatever it is, you're going to undo it. Whether I believe it's real or not doesn't matter. You go away tonight and you undo everything you've attempted. Do you understand me?" Andrew nodded. In retrospect, I should have taken the bag from him. Later that afternoon, I was on a free period marking a bunch of not very good essays from my Year 7s, when I suddenly heard an explosion of screaming coming from the end of the corridor. Getting up from my desk, I ran into the corridor to see what the matter was and found a crowd students had piled out of the classroom at the furthest end of the hallway. Some were screaming and crying, some were slumped against the walls with their hands clasped over their mouths. I was about to approach when Dawn Elderton, the head of English, burst out of the classroom, pointed at me and screamed for me to go to the office and call 911. She was covered in blood.
"We need an ambulance now."
So I did, as I was told. Later, in the staff room, I sat stunned as Dawn explained to me what had happened. By that time, the children had all gone home for the day, though several who were judged to be in shock had been treated and counselled by the ambulance workers. It was dark by that time. Dawn was sitting knees apart, leaning forward with her head hanging down like an exhausted boxer on his stool between rounds. She had thankfully taken off the jacket and blouse she had been wearing when I saw her earlier on account of how the sleeves and chest were covered all over with blood. Now she sat in an ill-fitting school PE jumper provided to her by the office staff. On the small table before she was a cup of hot tea I had added a few shots of whiskey to, after having retrieved the bottle I kept locked in my desk for special occasions with colleagues. Seeing the mug had been emptied, I refilled it, this time without the tea.
"It was like something out of a science fiction film," she said,
shaking her still hanging head.
"I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my life."
Dawn told me that they had been halfway through a lesson on Macbeth. She had a scene from the play projected onto the board and was analysing the lines with linguistic devices and important thematic elements that the kids might be expected to pick out for their exam questions. She was taking suggestions from the students, and each time one spotted a simile or an important piece of imagery, they would raise their hand to say where it was.
"She put her hand up and I pointed to her to say that she could answer,"
Dawn said. Now sitting up, but still shaking her head, as if the side-to-side movement would fling the idea from her mind like a dog shaking water from its fur.
She had stretched right up with her hand raised, almost out of her seat, and was about to speak. Her mouth opened, and then it just collapsed, folded in on itself. It was like seeing someone crush an empty Coke can, like if you grabbed it around the middle and just squeezed. Her face imploded. She straightened up, opened her mouth, and her jaw just snapped, not at the hinge, at the front, where her bottom row of teeth were, right in half. Then it smashed again and again as if someone had hit either side of her face with a sledgehammer, and everything was just bursting forward, the bones rupturing and popping through the skin. Bits of bone, all jagged and covered in pulp and tendons, just shot out, ripping through her cheeks, through her lips. Her front teeth shattered and fell out onto the desk in this bug lumpy spray, like blood and saliva, and she just kind of folded forward and slammed her head on the desk. She was thrashing and fighting it, but it was like the whole lower part of her face was being chewed off by something we couldn't see. I ran towards her, but by the time I got there, the whole lower portion from the cheekbones down had been smashed and crushed. It was just hanging there, all limp and slack, the skin all elastic, holding up the hard bits like big rocks in a hammock. The shapes were all wrong, just hanging there. The kids were all screaming, and I tried to scoop her into my arms to stop what was happening, but even then it was still going on. Most of the kids ran out, but I watched. I watched as all her teeth and gums were smashed together and all pressure built up like someone popping a pimple, until her back teeth just popped out one after another and just fell on the floor like a rag doll.
I heard all of this assuming throughout that what she was saying was impossible, but also knowing deep down that perhaps it wasn't. Perhaps such things could happen, and I had been naive to think that the bullied boy had been working on a love spell. I hadn't seen Andrew in the crowd that spilled from the classroom. He had slipped out silently from somewhere at the back and slinked off down the corridor, no doubt out of the door and off home. Later, before I went home, I went back to Dawn's classroom. The cleaners had just begun the horrible business of mopping up the pools of blood, and I saw one retrieving teeth from the ground and throwing them into a bin bag. I'm glad I got there before they started on the rest of the room, because if I had been a few minutes later, I would not have seen the small pile of artifacts left on a desk at the back of the room. There was the hair, the note, and the gum pinned to the table via a small nail. There were lines and symbols drawn directly onto the desk all around these objects, and at the back the tiny skull, the lower jaw of which had been entirely crushed in the bite of a pair of pliers. By that point, I had little doubt. I knew what had happened, and I also knew that I probably wouldn't see Andrew again. What I did not know was that very soon I would be seeing his mother, and without even knowing she'd done it, she would weave together several hideous threads to make the rope that would drag me, kicking and screaming, into a tragic and terrifying future.